July 30th, 1944. The morning situation room at 7th Army Headquarters, 5 kilometers northeast of Avranches. General Paul Hauser stood before the map, studying reports that made less sense with each passing hour. American armor had reached Avranches overnight. The town that was supposed to hold for weeks had fallen in hours. His staff officers moved pins across the map, trying to track American positions, but the pins kept moving south faster than they could update them. The numbers arriving from the front defied comprehension. The 4th Armored Division had covered over 40 miles in a single day. Not fighting through prepared positions. Not conducting careful reconnaissance. Simply racing forward as if the front no longer existed. And they were not slowing down. Reconnaissance reported American tanks already securing bridges over the Saloon River at Postwar, for miles south of Avranches. If those bridges held, there would be nothing between the Americans and Brittany. Nothing between them and the open country to the south and east. If you find the untold stories of World War II as fascinating as I do, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps me continue researching and sharing these incredible moments from history. Hauser ordered coffee and tried to piece together what had happened. 5 days earlier, on July 25th, the Americans had launched Operation Cobra. A massive aerial bombardment, the largest of the war. Over 1,500 bombers had dropped more than 3,000 tons of explosives on a narrow corridor northwest of St. Lo. The Panzer-led division, holding that sector, had simply ceased to exist. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, reported that 70% of his soldiers were dead, wounded, or so shell-shocked they could no longer fight. The division that had started the day with over 2,000 men and 45 tanks ended it with scattered remnants hiding in bomb craters. But that was just the beginning. What followed was not the methodical advance Hauser had expected. It was something else entirely. American armor poured through the gap before German commanders could even understand where the gap was. By July 27th, the 4th Armored Division was already approaching Coutances, 30 miles from the breakthrough point. By July 28th, they had taken it. By July 30th, they were at Avranches, another 20 miles south. In 5 days, the Americans had covered 60 miles through supposedly fortified territory. The telephone rang. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commander of OB West, calling from his headquarters at Saint-Germain. His voice was controlled, but Hauser could hear the strain beneath it. What was the situation at Avranches? Could the bridges be held? Were forces available to mount a counterattack? Hauser explained as carefully as he could. Avranches had fallen faster than anyone could have organized a defense. The American 4th Armored Division had appeared in the town before the garrison even knew they were coming. Units that had been fighting 40 miles north 2 days ago were now securing river crossings to the south. The speed was simply unprecedented. As for mounting a counterattack, there were no forces available. Every unit that could move had already been thrown into the line trying to stop the British around Curran. The western flank had been stripped bare to feed the eastern battle. Now the Americans were exploiting that weakness with a velocity that made response impossible. Von Kluge was silent for a moment. Then, carefully, he asked the question that mattered. The bridges at Postwar, were they intact? Hauser checked his notes. Reconnaissance reported all bridges over the Saloon still standing. The Americans had captured them before anyone could organize their demolition. Von Kluge's silence lasted longer this time. Both men understood what it meant. Those bridges were the gateway to everything. Through them, the Americans could pour into Brittany, turning west toward the ports of Brest and St. Malo. Or they could turn east, driving deep behind the entire German position in Normandy. With the bridges in American hands, the choice was Patton's to make. Hauser returned to the map after the call ended. His chief of staff, Brigadier General Rudolf Christoph Baron von Gersdorf, had just arrived from a forward command post. His report confirmed the disaster. American columns were moving in multiple directions simultaneously. Some were driving west into Brittany. Others were turning south. Still others were pushing east. It was as if the Americans had simply decided that the entire region belonged to them and were taking possession of it all at once. Von Gersdorf had personally witnessed the chaos at the front. German units were retreating faster than they could receive orders. Communications were severed. Telephone lines had been cut by bombing or simply overrun by advancing American armor. Radio equipment was destroyed or abandoned. Commanders were making decisions based on information hours old, only to discover that the situation had changed completely by the time their orders could be implemented. In several areas, German troops had no idea there had even been a breakthrough until American tanks appeared in their rear areas. The staff began running calculations. If the Americans maintained this pace, they would clear all of Brittany within 2 weeks. They would reach the Seine within a month. They would be at the German border by autumn. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. The American Third Army, officially activated just hours earlier under Lieutenant General George Patton, was advancing at a rate no modern army had ever sustained. Not the Germans in Poland. Not the Germans in France in 1940. Not even the Germans in the opening days of Barbarossa in Russia. What made it possible? Hauser studied the intelligence reports, searching for an explanation. The Americans had concentrated overwhelming force at the breakthrough point. Yes. But so had the Germans in their own campaigns. The Americans had complete air superiority. But that alone did not explain the speed. What Patton was doing was different in kind, not just degree. He was not pausing to consolidate gains. He was not stopping to reduce isolated German strongpoints. He was not waiting for his supply lines to catch up. He was simply driving forward, trusting that everything else would sort itself out. At OB West headquarters in Saint-Germain, von Kluge faced the same questions. His operations staff had compiled detailed reports on the American advance. The 4th Armored Division had covered 44 miles in 4 days. The 6th Armored Division, moving parallel to them, had achieved similar results. Behind them, infantry divisions were advancing faster than German units could retreat. The entire American front was in motion, pushing south and west with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Von Kluge was 62 years old. He had commanded armies in Poland, in France, in Russia. He knew what a breakthrough looked like. He knew what a pursuit looked like. This was something beyond either. The Americans were not breaking through German defenses. They were bypassing them. They were not pursuing a retreating enemy. They were driving through open country as if no enemy existed. The German 7th Army was not being defeated in battle. It was being left behind, isolated in pockets, while American armor raced past toward objectives 100 miles away. The comparison that kept forcing itself into von Kluge's mind was his own experience in Russia. In June 1941, German panzer divisions had torn through Soviet defenses with unprecedented speed. They had advanced hundreds of miles in weeks, encircling entire Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. It had been the pinnacle of modern military achievement. And now, 3 years later, an American general was doing the same thing to Germany. With the same weapons. With the same tactics. But faster. Von Kluge called his intelligence chief for an assessment. How many divisions did Patton have? The answer came back. 12 divisions, roughly 300,000 men, over 4,000 tanks and armored vehicles. The numbers were solid, confirmed by aerial reconnaissance, radio intercepts, captured documents. What was not solid was understanding how those divisions were being used. A German panzer division, even at full strength, might advance 20 miles in a day under ideal conditions. No opposition, good roads, perfect weather. In combat, against resistance, 10 miles was good progress. 15 was exceptional. The American 4th Armored Division was covering 40 to 50 miles per day. While fighting, while capturing towns, while taking thousands of prisoners. And they had been doing it for 5 consecutive days without pause. The physical impossibility of it was maddening. Tanks needed fuel. They needed maintenance. Crews needed rest. Supply columns could only move so fast. And yet, somehow, Patton's armor was sustaining a rate of advance that should have been impossible. The telephone rang again. Berlin. Hitler's headquarters demanding an explanation. Von Kluge took the call in his private office, steeling himself for what was coming. The Führer's voice was sharp, insistent. How had this happened? Why had Avranches fallen so quickly? Why were American tanks racing through France unopposed? Von Kluge explained the situation as precisely as he could. The Americans had achieved breakthrough at Saint-Lô through overwhelming aerial bombardment. They had concentrated massive force at a single point. The Panzer-led division had been effectively destroyed. Now they were exploiting that breakthrough with unprecedented speed and aggression. German forces in the west simply did not have the strength to stop them. Every available panzer division was committed to holding the line against the British and Canadians around Caen. The western flank had been deliberately weakened to reinforce the east. Now Patton was driving through that weakened sector faster than reserves could be moved to block him. Hitler's response was predictable. Counterattack. Strike west from Mortain toward Avranches. Cut off Patton's supply line at its narrowest point. Without supplies, the Third Army would wither and die. The plan was already being prepared. Operation Lüttich. 4 panzer divisions would attack from Mortain, driving west to the coast at Avranches. The objective was not just to cut Patton's supply line, but to trap Third Army against the Atlantic and destroy it. Von Kluge tried to explain the reality. The panzer divisions were under strength, exhausted from weeks of continuous combat. Any movement in daylight would bring immediate attack from American fighter bombers. The Americans had complete air superiority. P-47 Thunderbolts armed with rockets and bombs patrolled the skies constantly. Any German column that moved during daylight hours was spotted within minutes and destroyed within the hour. The counterattack would need to succeed quickly, in a matter of days, or it would simply add to the disaster. Hitler was unmoved. The attack would proceed. It was the only way to prevent total collapse. Von Kluge hung up and returned to the map room. His staff was waiting. They had heard enough of the conversation to know what was coming. The operations officer began drafting orders for the counterattack. 4 panzer divisions, the 2nd Panzer, the 116th Panzer, and the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer. Perhaps 200 tanks total. Against an American army that already had thousands of tanks flooding through the Avranches Gap and showed no sign of slowing down. The intelligence officer pulled together information on American positions around Mortain. It was not encouraging. The town sat 19 miles east of Avranches. The counterattack would be striking not at Patton's spearhead but at his rear areas. And those rear areas were already filling with fresh American divisions. The Third Army was not a narrow penetration that could be cut off. It was a flood of armor and infantry pouring through a gap that grew wider every day. But orders were orders. The counterattack would be launched on August 7th, 13 days from now. The panzer divisions would be assembled in secret. They would attack before dawn, hoping to achieve surprise and gain ground before American aircraft could respond. The goal was ambitious. Drive 30 miles to the coast in 2 days, severing Patton's supply line and trapping his army in Brittany. On paper, it was possible. In reality, von Kluge knew, it was desperation. While the Germans planned their counterattack, Patton kept moving. On the evening of July 30th, reconnaissance troops from the 4th Armored Division reached the bridge at Pontorbo. They found it intact, undefended. The German units assigned to hold or destroy the bridge had not yet arrived. The Americans secured it immediately and radioed back to division headquarters. The bridge was theirs. The gateway to Brittany was open. Patton, upon hearing the news, gave immediate orders. Get divisions across that bridge. Now. Do not wait for engineers to inspect it. Do not wait for infantry to secure the far side. Get armor across and keep it moving. The 4th and 6th Armored Divisions were to cross immediately, followed by infantry. Speed was everything. The Germans would try to retake the bridge. They would try to destroy it with air attacks. But if American divisions could get across fast enough, in sufficient numbers, nothing the Germans could do would matter. Over the next 72 hours, 7 American divisions crossed the Pontorbo Bridge. Engineers worked around the clock, reinforcing the structure to handle the weight of Sherman tanks. Traffic flowed 24 hours a day. Columns of vehicles, bumper to bumper, crossing from Normandy into Brittany. The Germans attempted several counterattacks during the night of July 31st, trying to recapture the bridge. All failed. They organized two air attacks on August 4th and 7th, using Henschel-guided glide bombs designed to destroy the structure. Both attacks missed their target. The bridge remained intact, and American divisions continued to pour across it. Patton himself visited Pontorbo on August 1st, the day his Third Army was officially activated. He stood on the bank of the saloon and watched his divisions cross. Tanks, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, infantry in trucks, supply vehicles. The greatest concentration of mobile power ever assembled, all flowing through a single bottleneck, all driving toward objectives that changed by the hour as the situation evolved faster than plans could be drawn. His orders to his division commanders were simple. Do not stop. When you encounter resistance, go around it. When you capture a town, leave minimal forces to secure it and keep moving. When your fuel runs low, keep going until it runs out, then wait for supplies to catch up. The enemy is already beaten. They just do not know it yet. Our job is to make sure they do not have time to recover. Speed is the weapon. Use it. The 6th Armored Division, under Major General Robert Grow, was ordered to drive straight for Brest, 200 miles to the west. Patton told Grow he wanted the port captured within 5 days. It was an absurd timeline. Brest was fortified, garrisoned by thousands of German troops. But Grow understood what Patton understood. The Germans were psychologically shattered. If American armor appeared at the gates of Brest before the garrison could organize a defense, there was a chance the city might fall without a fight. It was worth trying. The worst that could happen was that the division would have to stop and lay siege. The best was that speed and shock would do what firepower could not. The 4th Armored Division, under Major General John Wood, was sent south and east toward Rennes, the capital of Brittany. Wood's orders were equally aggressive. Bypass resistance, capture the city, then turn east toward the interior of France. Behind them, infantry divisions would mop up isolated German garrisons. The armored divisions were not to be slowed by the need to reduce every strong point. Their job was to keep the Germans off balance, to prevent them from forming any coherent defensive line. Back at 7th Army headquarters, Hauser watched the situation deteriorate hour by hour. American divisions were now spread across a front 200 miles wide. They were moving in 4 different directions. Some west into Brittany, some south toward the Loire, some east toward Paris, some north, actually circling back behind German positions that had been bypassed in the initial rush. The front, as a recognizable line on a map, no longer existed. There were just areas where American forces had been reported and areas where they had not yet been reported. Communication with forward units was breaking down entirely. Telephone lines were cut. Radio stations were overrun. Couriers sent with orders never arrived, either killed in transit or finding that the units they were sent to no longer existed. Commanders were making decisions in isolation, with no clear understanding of the larger situation, often learning that their positions had been outflanked only when American tanks appeared behind them. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. Soldiers who had held their positions for weeks against British and Canadian attacks around Caen now found themselves in full retreat, racing to escape American armor that seemed to be everywhere at once. Units that tried to make stands were bypassed and left isolated. Units that retreated found American tanks blocking roads they thought were secure. The sense of being surrounded, of being trapped in a closing net, spread through the German ranks faster than any actual American advance. Von Gersdorff, Hauser's chief of staff, compiled a report for OB West on the evening of August 1st. The 7th Army had effectively lost control of western France. American forces had penetrated so deeply and so quickly that organized resistance was no longer possible. German garrisons in Brittany were isolated. The ports of Brest, Saint-Malo, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire were cut off from reinforcement or supply. Tens of thousands of troops were trapped in fortresses that no longer served any strategic purpose. The war had moved past them. More critically, the entire German position in Normandy was now untenable. The Third Army was driving east at the same time it was driving west. American columns were approaching Le Mans, formerly the headquarters of the 7th Army, now 100 miles behind the front. If Le Mans fell, if the Americans pushed farther east toward Alençon and Argentan, they would be behind the entire German force still fighting around Turin. The possibility of encirclement, of the entire army Group B being trapped in a pocket, was becoming real. At OB West, von Kluge read Gersdorf's report and made a decision. He would fly to Berlin and present the situation to Hitler in person. A withdrawal was necessary. The 7th Army needed to pull back behind the Seine immediately. Defensive positions could be prepared there. The front could be stabilized. But it had to happen now, before Patton's eastward drive cut off any possibility of retreat. He never made that flight. On August 2nd, before he could leave for Berlin, new orders arrived from Hitler. No withdrawal. No retreat. Instead, attack. Operation Lüttich would proceed as planned. 8 panzer divisions, Hitler demanded. The counterattack must use 8 of the 9 panzer divisions available in Normandy. It must drive to the coast at Avranches. It must cut off and destroy Patton's army. This was not a suggestion. It was a direct order from the Führer himself. Von Kluge read the order and understood that he had no choice. To refuse would be to invite his own arrest. To argue further would accomplish nothing. Hitler believed the situation could be restored through willpower and aggression. He believed that Patton's advance, spectacular as it appeared, was actually a vulnerability. The Third Army had pushed so far, so fast, that its supply line was stretched impossibly thin. One good blow at the right place would sever that line and leave Patton stranded deep in French territory with no fuel, no ammunition, no hope of rescue. The logic was not entirely wrong. Patton's supply line was thin. His divisions were operating at the extreme edge of their logistical range. But what Hitler did not understand, what von Kluge was only beginning to grasp, was that Patton had anticipated this. He had planned for it. He had built his entire operational concept around the assumption that supplies would always be inadequate, that logistics would always be a crisis, and that the way to solve that crisis was not to wait for supplies to catch up but to keep moving so fast that the enemy could never establish defenses. Speed was not just a tactic for Patton. It was the strategy. Von Kluge called a conference with his senior commanders. General Hans Eberbach, commander of Panzer Group West. General Paul Hauser of 7th Army. General Heinrich Eberbach, who would command the forces assigned to Operation Lüttich. He explained the situation carefully. The Führer had ordered a counterattack. 4 panzer divisions would strike west from Mortain toward Avranches on August 7th. The goal was to reach the coast and cut Patton's supply line. Success would trap the Third Army in Brittany. Failure would doom the entire German position in France. The commanders listened in silence. Then, one by one, they voiced their concerns. The panzer divisions were under strength. The 2nd Panzer had perhaps 50 tanks fit for action. The 116th Panzer had 40. The 1st SS Panzer had 70. The 2nd SS Panzer had 60. Combined, the 4 divisions could field perhaps 220 tanks. Against an enemy that had thousands. More critically, the Americans would have air superiority. Any daylight movement would be suicidal. The Luftwaffe had promised fighter support, claiming they could clear the skies over Mortain. But everyone in the room knew this was fantasy. The Luftwaffe had been promising air support for weeks. It never materialized. British and American fighters controlled the skies completely. German aircraft that took off were engaged before they could reach the battlefield. The idea that 1,000 fighters would suddenly appear to protect the counterattack was absurd. If this deep dive into Operation Cobra and Patton's breakthrough has been valuable, I'd be grateful if you'd hit the like button. It helps others discover these detailed historical accounts that go beyond the surface-level narratives. Von Kluge acknowledged these concerns. He shared them. But the order stood. The attack would proceed on August 7th. They would strike before dawn, hoping to gain ground in the pre-dawn darkness before American aircraft could respond. They would drive hard for Avranches, trusting that speed and surprise could accomplish what strength could not. It was a desperate gamble. But it was the only card they had left to play. The conference ended. The commanders returned to their headquarters to prepare. Von Kluge remained at the map, studying the dispositions. The American Third Army now stretched from Brest on the Atlantic coast to Le Mans 100 miles to the east. In 10 days, Patton had liberated half of Brittany and was threatening to drive into the interior of France. The speed of it was still incomprehensible. No army in history had moved this fast for this long while maintaining combat effectiveness. What the German High Command was beginning to understand, slowly and painfully, was that they were not facing a conventional military operation. They were facing a new kind of warfare. Patton had taken the German concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning war that had conquered Europe, and perfected it. He had eliminated the pauses that traditionally slowed offensive operations. He had eliminated the need to consolidate gains before pushing forward. He had eliminated the careful planning that normally preceded each phase of an advance. Instead, he had created a system of continuous movement, where divisions advanced until they ran out of fuel, then waited while supplies caught up, then advanced again immediately. The Germans had invented blitzkrieg. They had used it to devastating effect in Poland, France, and Russia. But they had always combined rapid movement with careful consolidation. After a breakthrough, panzer divisions would pause to allow infantry to catch up. After capturing an objective, they would establish defensive positions before pushing further. After advancing a certain distance, they would stop to reorganize and resupply. These pauses were considered necessary, prudent, professional. Patton had dispensed with all of it. His divisions did not pause. They did not consolidate. They did not stop to reorganize. They simply kept moving, day after day, accepting that their formations would become disorganized, that their supply situation would be chaotic, that their flanks would be exposed. None of it mattered because the enemy was even more disorganized, even more chaotic, completely unable to respond to the speed of the advance. On August 7th, at 2:30 in the morning, Operation Luttich began. 4 panzer divisions attacked west from Mortain toward Avranches. The 2nd Panzer Division led the assault, pushing toward the village of Juvigny. The 116th Panzer struck toward Le Mesnil-Adélie. Behind them, the 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Divisions prepared to exploit whatever breakthrough the initial assault achieved. For the first few hours, it worked. The Americans, surprised by the sudden attack, gave ground. German tanks pushed several miles into American lines. Radio messages flashed back to OB West. Progress being made, resistance light, advance continuing. Von Kluge allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps the plan would succeed. Perhaps the counterattack would reach Avranches, cut Patton's supply line, trap Third Army in Brittany. Then the sun came up. With it came the American fighter bombers. P-47 Thunderbolts appeared in the sky by the dozens, then by the hundreds. They fell on the German columns with methodical precision. Every road became a killing ground. Every crossroads turned into a graveyard of burning vehicles. Tanks that had survived the initial strikes pulled into woods, seeking cover under trees. But the Americans had rockets that could penetrate any armor, and pilots who had spent weeks hunting German tanks in Normandy. They knew exactly what they were doing. By noon on August 7th, the counterattack had stalled. German commanders reported they could not move in daylight. American air attacks were too intense. They requested permission to continue the attack after dark. Von Kluge granted it, but he knew the truth. The attack had failed. The Americans had not been surprised. They had not been caught off balance. They had absorbed the German thrust and stopped it cold. What von Kluge did not know was that the Americans had known the attack was coming. Ultra-intelligence, the Allied ability to decrypt German communications, had provided advance warning of Operation Luttich. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, had positioned forces to meet the attack. When the panzers struck, they ran into prepared defenses. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover every approach. Artillery was pre-registered on likely routes of advance. Infantry was dug in and ready. The surprise the Germans counted on never existed. By August 8th, it was clear Operation Luttich had failed completely. The 4 panzer divisions that attacked with 220 tanks came back with fewer than 70. They had gained a few miles of ground at the cost of catastrophic losses. They had accomplished nothing except to weaken themselves further at the moment when those tanks were desperately needed elsewhere. While the counterattack failed at Mortain, Patton kept moving. The Third Army had not slowed down. American columns pushed deeper into Brittany, capturing Rennes on August 4th, reaching the outskirts of Brest by August 6th. Other columns drove east, taking Le Mans on August 8th. Still others pushed south toward the Loire. The American advance had become so widespread that German commanders stopped trying to track it. There were simply too many American divisions moving in too many directions. Von Kluge returned to his headquarters after the failure at Mortain and drafted a report to Berlin. He chose his words carefully, knowing they might be his last. The situation in France was no longer sustainable. The counterattack had failed. The Seventh Army was in danger of encirclement. The Third Army was now beyond any possibility of containment. Army Group B needed to withdraw behind the Seine immediately or risk total destruction. Every hour of delay increased the danger. The response from Berlin came swiftly. Von Kluge was relieved of command. Field Marshal Walter Model, brought from the Eastern Front, would take over as commander of OB West and Army Group B. Von Kluge was ordered to return to Germany immediately. The message was clear. He was being recalled not for retirement but for punishment. His warnings about the situation in France, his requests to withdraw, his pessimistic assessments, all had been noted. In the paranoid atmosphere following the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, any general who counseled retreat was suspect. Von Kluge received the order on August 15th. He spent his last day at headquarters preparing the handover to Model. Model arrived on August 17th, energetic and confident, known as Hitler's fireman for his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts on the Eastern Front. He spent 2 hours reviewing the situation, reading the reports, studying the maps. Then he called von Kluge into his office. "Tell me honestly," Model said. "Can this be stabilized?" Von Kluge looked at the map. The Third Army now stretched from the Atlantic to the interior of France, a front 200 miles wide. They had reached the Seine at multiple points. Paris was directly threatened. The Seventh Army was collapsing at Falaise, where British and Canadian forces were closing a pocket that threatened to trap the entire army. Most of Army Group B was in danger of being cut off. The Americans were advancing faster than German units could retreat. "No," von Kluge said. "It cannot be stabilized. We need to withdraw everything behind the Seine immediately. Even then, I am not certain we can save the army." Model nodded slowly. He had commanded armies in Russia. He had seen disasters before. But this was different. The Americans were not just defeating the German army. They were outrunning it, getting behind it, surrounding it before it could even establish defensive positions. He asked the question that von Kluge had been asking himself for weeks. What makes them so fast? Von Kluge considered his answer. It is not one thing. It is everything. They have overwhelming air power, so we cannot move by day. They have endless supplies, so they never stop to consolidate. They have fresh divisions arriving constantly, so they can maintain pressure indefinitely. But most of all, they have a commander who understands that speed itself is a weapon. Patton does not pause. He does not give us time to react. By the time we understand where he is already somewhere else. By the time we move forces to block him, he has gone around them. Speed creates confusion. Confusion creates opportunity. Opportunity creates more speed. It is a cycle we cannot break. Von Kluge left headquarters on August 18th. He never reached Germany. On August 19th, on the road between France and Berlin, he stopped his car and took cyanide. He left a letter for Hitler. In it, he described the situation in France as hopeless. He praised the courage of German soldiers who had fought against impossible odds. He accepted responsibility for the defeat, though he noted carefully that the forces available had been insufficient for the task required. And he suggested, as diplomatically as possible, that perhaps it was time to consider ending the war before Germany was destroyed completely. Hitler never responded to the letter. Model continued the fight in France for another month, conducting a fighting retreat that saved portions of Army Group B but could not change the fundamental reality. By September, the Third Army had advanced 400 miles from Normandy. They had liberated most of France. They had reached the German border. The lightning campaign that German generals thought impossible had become the defining American operation of the war. In the map room at OB West headquarters, now relocated far to the east, staff officers continued updating situation maps. They tracked American positions as best they could. But the pins marking Third Army's location now sat at the Rhine, at the very edge of Germany itself. The advance that seemed impossible in July had continued for 2 months without pause. There had been nowhere left to retreat. Model, reviewing the campaign in late August, called his intelligence officer for a final assessment. How many divisions does Third Army have now? The same 12 divisions, sir, that they started with. And how much ground have they covered? Approximately 400 miles in 2 months, sir. Model did the mathematics. 50 miles per week. 7 miles per day, every single day for 2 months, while fighting, while capturing prisoners, while liberating cities. He verified the numbers again. They were accurate. What did Patton do differently? Model asked. The intelligence officer had studied this question intensively. Sir, he did not stop. When we built defenses, he went around them. When we concentrated forces, he found gaps. When we tried to cut his supply lines, he kept moving forward and trusted supplies would catch up. He treated the advance not as a series of operations but as continuous movement. He never gave us time to react, time to reorganize, time to prepare. The speed itself was the weapon. Model understood. The Germans had pioneered this kind of warfare. They had called it blitzkrieg. They had used it to conquer most of Europe. But they had never sustained it the way Patton sustained it. They had never moved that fast, that far, with that much continuous pressure. An American general had taken German doctrine and perfected it beyond what its creators thought possible. The war would continue for 9 more months. But for the German High Command, something fundamental had changed in those 72 hours at Avranches. They had watched an American army break through their lines and then simply keep going, covering distances in days that should have taken weeks, achieving results that should have been impossible. They had tried to stop it and failed. They had tried to understand it and found their assumptions inadequate. They had watched their entire position in France collapse not because they were defeated in battle but because they were outrun, bypassed, left behind by an enemy moving too fast to engage. What the German High Command said, in their reports and conferences and private conversations, was simple. They had never seen anything like it. Not in Poland. Not in France. Not in Russia. Not in any campaign in modern military history. An army had crossed France in 2 months, covering hundreds of miles, liberating hundreds of towns, destroying dozens of divisions, and it had done so while suffering relatively light casualties and maintaining operational tempo that never slowed. The breakthrough at Avranches had taken 72 hours. In those 3 days, American armor had secured the bridges at Pontorbo, poured 7 divisions across the Saloon, and positioned themselves to exploit in any direction Patton chose. What followed was not just a successful operation. It was a demonstration that the nature of warfare had changed. Speed, sustained over time, could accomplish what firepower alone could not. An enemy that could not be caught could not be defeated. And an army that refused to stop, that pushed forward relentlessly day after day, could shatter defenses that looked impregnable on paper. The German generals who watched it happen understood, perhaps better than anyone, what they were witnessing. They had built their own reputation on rapid, aggressive warfare. They had conquered a continent using those principles. And now they were being defeated by an enemy who had learned those lessons and applied them with a ruthlessness the Germans had never quite achieved. Patton had taken blitzkrieg and made it faster, longer, more devastating. He had turned it from a tactical innovation into an operational art form. In the end, what the German High Command said about Avranches was what soldiers have always said when they encounter something that breaks all their assumptions about what is possible. They said it could not be done. They said the logistics would not support it. They said the troops would exhaust themselves. They said the supply lines would snap. They said any army that moved that fast would outrun its own support and collapse from its own success. And then they watched it happen anyway. They watched Patton break through at Avranches in 72 hours and keep going for 2 months. They watched American armor cover 400 miles while they scrambled to respond. They watched their entire defensive system in France come apart because the enemy moved faster than their decision cycle could handle. They watched and learned that all their careful calculations about what was possible in modern warfare had been wrong. Speed, it turned out, changed everything. And an army that refused to stop, that embraced chaos and disorder as the price of momentum, could achieve results that looked miraculous to observers who still thought in terms of conventional operations. The breakthrough at Avranches lasted 72 hours. Its effects lasted for the rest of the war. German generals who survived the campaign carried those lessons with them. They had seen the future of warfare, and it was faster than anything they had imagined. What they said, in the moment and in the years after, was that Patton had done the impossible. He had taken an operational concept the Germans thought they owned and used it to destroy them. And he had done it with a speed that made their own greatest achievements look slow by comparison. Thank you for watching this exploration of one of World War II's most decisive operations. If you'd like to see more detailed analyses of pivotal moments in military history, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video.